Have you ever stopped to think about why you speak the way you do? What does your voice say about you? What if your intonation, accent, or even your choice of words were decisive in how the world perceives you? Ludwig Wittgenstein once said, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." But perhaps the way we express ourselves defines something even deeper. Could it be that if we spoke differently, we would be different people? Our voice isn't just a sound. It carries a history and identity, a sense of belonging. At the same time, it can be either a passport or a barrier to certain opportunities. Think about this. How many times have you heard someone change their tone when speaking to their boss, or adjust their accent when presenting themselves in a new environment? These small changes aren't random. They're part of a social game where our way of speaking adapts to invisible rules of acceptance and exclusion. French philosopher Michel Foucault argued that discourse isn't just a means of communication, but a field of power struggle. The way we speak can open or close doors. Some voices are valued, while others are marginalized. Pierre Bourdieu called this linguistic capital, the idea that our way of speaking can grant or deny us status within society. And this happens from infancy. Studies show that babies, even before learning to speak, already show preference for voices that resemble those of their caregivers. Children choose their friends more based on accent than appearance. In adult life, this instinct becomes prejudiced. People with accents considered different can be perceived as less intelligent, less trustworthy, less competent, even when saying exactly the same words. This brings us to a case. Manuel Fragante, a war veteran with an impeccable resume, lost a job opportunity simply because his Filipino accent made the interviewers uncomfortable. He fought this discrimination legally but lost. The court decided that denying someone a position because of how they speak wasn't illegal. Fragante didn't lose the job due to lack of qualifications, but because his voice, his sound, his way of speaking didn't fit what was considered socially acceptable. This demonstrates that behind what seems to be just a detail, an entire system of exclusion and belonging operates in silence. Jean-Paul Sartre said that hell is other people, but perhaps the real hell is what others do with our voice. Philosopher Frantz Fanon knew this well. Studying the effects of colonization on the psyche of peoples, he realized that one of the first attacks against a dominated culture wasn't just physical, but linguistic. Governments banned native languages, imposed foreign dialects, and mold voices to erase identities. The apartheid did this in South Africa. Franco's regime tried to eradicate Catalan and Basque in Spain. Whenever someone wants to control a population, they begin by silencing their voices. But what if resistance came precisely through speech? Judith Butler talks about the performativity of language, suggesting that our identity isn't fixed, but a constant act of representation. This explains why some groups reclaim their ways of speaking as a flag of resistance. Think of rappers who transform marginalized English into protest poetry, or indigenous languages that remain alive despite centuries of repression. The way we speak can be an act of submission or subversion, and in the midst of this invisible war of voices, the digital world is changing the rules of the game. Marshall McLuhan said that, "The medium is the message. The way we speak is being redefined by the internet. Dialects are merging, new communication patterns are emerging. Formal English no longer dominates the global stage. Influencers with regional accents are going viral. For the first time in history, voices that were once silenced are being heard." But does this mean linguistic discrimination will disappear? Or are we just replacing one form of exclusion with another? Zygmunt Bauman's theory of liquid modernity makes us reflect. Are we really becoming more inclusive, or are we simply flowing toward new patterns of exclusion? In the end, Nietzsche was right when he said there are no facts, only interpretations. The way we speak shapes how others perceive us and consequently defines part of our identity. The question is, if your voice were different, would your destiny be different too? If how we speak defines us, then who are we really? Is our identity an internal and authentic reflection, or just a construction shaped by others' expectations? If Jean-Paul Sartre said that the gaze of others transforms us, what can we say about our voice? The uncomfortable truth is that no one speaks the same way all the time. Our intonation, rhythm, and even word choices change depending on the environment and company. This happens because language isn't just a communication tool. It's a social mirror reflecting our need to belong. A study by linguist Penelope Eckert showed that teenagers within the same school modified their way of speaking depending on the group they identified with. The jocks, athletes, spoke differently from the burnouts, more rebellious youth. The curious thing is that at their core, they all belonged to the same community. What changed was how they wanted to be perceived. This adaptation isn't just limited to adolescence. In a business meeting, an executive might adopt a deeper, firmer tone to demonstrate authority. Among friends, that same tone becomes more relaxed and casual. This constant adaptation relates to Pierre Bourdieu's concept of linguistic capital. Like money or status, our way of speaking can be a social asset. Those who master the standard language have better chances of being heard, respected, and accepted. Meanwhile, those whose speech deviates from the norm may be excluded, stereotyped, or silenced. The major problem is that this norm isn't neutral. It has been constructed over time to favor certain groups at the expense of others. A classic example of this social imposition occurred in South Africa during apartheid, when the government banned native language teaching in schools and imposed Afrikaans as the mandatory language. The goal wasn't just to teach a new language, but to force an identity, a submission. The same happened in Spain during Franco's dictatorship when they tried to eradicate Catalan and Basque. When a language is silenced, an entire people loses part of their history, identity, and existence. But this oppression doesn't always occur through explicit prohibition. Often it happens more subtly and silently. Think of migrants arriving in a new country, immediately judged by their accent, or a child entering school to discover that how their parents speak at home isn't considered correct. These small moments teach, almost imperceptibly, that some voices are more accepted than others. Philosopher Judith Butler argues that identity is a performance, something we constantly adjust to be accepted. If this is true, then our way of speaking is one of the main tools of that performance. When a young person leaves their hometown to study in another region and returns speaking differently, they haven't just changed their voice. They've adjusted their very identity to fit into the new environment. This phenomenon isn't conscious but deeply rooted in the human desire to belong. The impact of linguistic prejudice. If language is a social mirror, what happens when it reflects an image we don't want to see? Linguistic prejudice is one of the most invisible yet cruel forms of discrimination. It's not just about words, it's about power. If someone makes a grammatical mistake, they're quickly labeled as ignorant. If someone has a strong foreign accent, they might be seen as less trustworthy. How one speaks shouldn't be a filter for determining a person's worth, but in practice, that's exactly what happens. Yet there is resistance. In historically marginalized communities, reclaiming language becomes an act of affirmation. In the United States, African-American vernacular English, often called Black English, was stigmatized for a long time, but has transformed into a powerful form of cultural expression, present in rap, literature, and film. The same happens with the use of peripheral slang, once considered a sign of ignorance, now symbols of identity and resistance. The great paradox is that language, despite connecting us, also separates us. We build invisible walls with words, subtle divisions between what's acceptable and what's strange. Wittgenstein said language is a game, but who makes the rules? Who decides which way of speaking is legitimate and which isn't? If a foreigner speaks your language haltingly, do you see them as less intelligent? If someone has a strong accent, does it bother you without you realizing it? If a grammatical error appears in an email, is your first reaction to doubt the sender's competence? Linguistic prejudice is one of the most stealthy forms of discrimination because it disguises itself as common sense. It's not seen as a problem of intolerance, but of correctness. But correct according to whom? Michel Foucault said that power is exercised not only through violence, but through the imposition of norms. And few norms are as arbitrary as those of language. Who determines which accent is most pleasant? Who decided certain words are mispronounced? Who turned one group's way of speaking into a sign of inferiority? In courts, studies show that witnesses with foreign accents are seen as less reliable than those who speak with a standard accent. This means that even when two people say exactly the same words, the one with an unfamiliar accent will be less credible. This pattern repeats in job interviews, salary negotiations, and even how customers are treated in stores. Psychologist Catherine Kinsler conducted a fascinating experiment demonstrating how this bias begins in childhood. Young children were shown two identical images but with different voices, one with a native accent and another with a foreign accent. The children consistently preferred the image with the more familiar-sounding voice. This shows that linguistic prejudice isn't something we consciously learn, but a natural tendency that, when unchallenged, becomes real discrimination. This phenomenon also reflects in the real estate market. Research indicates that people seeking to rent housing who speak with non-standard accents have more difficulty securing a contract, even when their income and credit are identical to native speakers. The discrimination isn't in the numbers, it's in the sound. But is this rejection the result of genuine comprehension difficulties? In most cases, no. In one study, university students listened to a professor's lecture and were asked to transcribe it. The only difference was that half the students were told the professor was a native speaker, while the other half were told he was foreign. The result? Students who believed the professor was foreign reported greater difficulty understanding him, although the audio was exactly the same for everyone. This proves a simple but disturbing idea. Often it's not language that prevents us from understanding others, but our own prejudices. If we assume someone will have difficulty communicating, we create that barrier even before listening. These prejudices manifest even more brutally in childhood. Children who speak regional dialects or use colloquial expressions are often corrected in school as if their way of speaking were an error rather than simply a linguistic variation. Gradually, they learn that their original voice isn't welcome. They're forced to adopt a way of speaking that doesn't belong to them, while children from higher classes see their way of speaking valued as correct. Pierre Bourdieu called this symbolic violence, when one group imposes its cultural norms as the only legitimate ones, making others internalize this hierarchy as natural. The result is that millions of people worldwide spend their lives trying to modify their speech, attempting to erase their accents, trying to appear more socially acceptable. The question that remains is, why don't we do the opposite? Instead of expecting everyone to speak the same way, why don't we train our ears to listen better? This is essential for understanding what comes next. Language doesn't just separate people, it can also be an act of existence. If how we speak includes or excludes us from certain social circles, what happens when we decide not to change? When we embrace our voice as it is? If language is a tool of exclusion, it can also be an instrument of resistance. What happens when someone refuses to change their voice to fit in? When a group decides to reclaim their own way of speaking as a banner of identity? That's the point where language stops being just a means of communication and becomes a battlefield. Frantz Fanon, studying the psychological impacts of colonialism, realized that one of the first attacks against a dominated people occurs not with weapons, but with words. Colonizers didn't just impose new languages, they made colonized peoples feel ashamed of their own way of speaking. The goal wasn't just political domination, but the destruction of identity. For Fanon, reclaiming one's voice was a revolutionary act. This dynamic repeated in South Africa, where during apartheid, black students were forced to learn in Afrikaans, the language of the white minority. In 1976, thousands of students in Soweto rebelled against this imposition, protesting against the ban on studying in their native languages. The government's response was brutal, but the message was clear. Language wasn't just a detail, it was a matter of identity, belonging, and freedom. Something similar happened in Spain under Franco's dictatorship, which tried to erase Catalan and Basque from the cultural landscape. For decades, speaking these languages in public could result in persecution. Yet even under repression, people continued speaking, writing, and preserving their languages. Today, after years of struggle, these languages haven't just survived. They've strengthened as symbols of resistance and cultural identity. But linguistic resistance doesn't just occur in major revolutions, it happens in daily life, in small acts. In the United States, African-American vernacular English was long viewed as an inferior form of English, something to be corrected in school or eliminated in the workplace. But instead of being erased, it transformed into art. In rap, literature, film. This language became a powerful cultural affirmation. The same happens with slang and marginalized accents worldwide. The speech patterns of the periphery, long treated as signs of ignorance, resist, reinvent themselves, and often become symbols of belonging and strength. Judith Butler argues that identity is a continuous process of performativity, something we express and reaffirm daily. If true, then how we speak isn't just a neutral detail, but a choice that communicates who we are and which group we belong to. Choosing to maintain an accent, slang, or specific intonation can be a way of saying, "I know you expect me to change, but I refuse." The question is, will this resistance be accepted, or will society continue punishing those who speak outside what's considered correct? The answer may be emerging now in the digital age, where new forms of language are challenging old standards. For centuries, language rules were dictated by institutions, academies of letters, governments, educational systems. But now, who decides how we speak? The internet, social media, memes, viral videos, and streaming platforms are redefining not just what we say, but how we say it. What was once seen as an error can now become a trend. What was marginal can now become part of popular culture. The digital revolution is breaking down old linguistic barriers. But is it creating new ones? Marshall McLuhan, communication theorist, said that the medium is the message, meaning how we communicate matters as much as what we communicate. Think about it. Twitter limited writing to 280 characters, changing how we structure our ideas. WhatsApp eliminated the need for formal punctuation. TikTok and YouTube are promoting regional accents because video allows authentic voices to reach millions without institutional filters. For the first time in history, a young person with a strong provincial accent can discuss philosophy and be heard by millions. A migrant can create a channel and gain more respect than they would in a job interview. People from different parts of the world can mix languages, creating new digital dialects. Is this inclusion or simply a new system of exclusion? Sigmund Bauman said we live in a liquid modernity where everything is constantly changing. This applies to language too. Rules that were once rigid are now dissolving, but new linguistic hierarchies are emerging in the digital world. Those who fluently master internet language gain relevance. Those who don't understand meme codes, emojis, and digital slang may end up excluded. Another problem, while the internet amplifies previously silenced voices, social media algorithms prioritize certain speech patterns. A video with a pleasant accent might reach more people than one with a less common accent. YouTube itself has been accused of automatically penalizing content from Black or Latino creators because its algorithm didn't recognize their speech patterns as comprehensible as standard English. So are we really becoming more inclusive or just creating new forms of discrimination? If linguistic barriers were once regional, they're now digital. If norms were once imposed by governments, they're now shaped by artificial intelligence. Are we really freeing ourselves from linguistic prejudices or just delegating that exclusion to algorithms? The answer may lie in our perception of language. The words we choose to use and how we decide to listen to others will determine whether we're building bridges or new walls. What does this mean for you? Does your voice, how you speak, bring you closer to or further from people? If how we speak shapes our identity and future, then who do you become when you decide to speak as you truly want? If how we speak defines how we're perceived, how free are we to be who we really are? Is our identity just an adjustable construction, a reflection of what society expects to hear? Or is there something essential in our voice that, if modified, would alter our very existence? Friedrich Nietzsche said there are no facts, only interpretations. Few things exemplify this better than language. The same speech can sound inspiring in one voice and completely irrelevant in another. The same words can be perceived as trustworthy or suspicious, depending on who speaks them. Speaking isn't just communication, it's an affirmation of existence. What we've seen throughout this video is that language is a contested field, an invisible filter deciding who belongs and who doesn't. Some voices are amplified, others silenced. Some accents are considered charming, others undesirable. But there's immense power in those who decide to keep their voice even when the world asks them to change it. There's strength in speaking as you want, even knowing it might close certain opportunities. Because ultimately, identity isn't just about adaptation, it's about authenticity. So I ask you, do you speak to be heard or to be accepted? If your voice were different, would you still be you? If you've made it this far, it means this conversation has touched you somehow. Perhaps it reminded you of a time when you felt your way of speaking was judged. Or maybe it made you realize that you too have judged someone for how they speak. I remember once watching a friend completely change their way of speaking when entering a job interview. Suddenly, they seemed like a different person. Their voice, previously full of accent and regional expressions, became rigid, almost rehearsed. Afterward, they told me, if I spoke how I really speak, they wouldn't take me seriously. That struck me because it wasn't just a change in tone. It was a dilemma about identity, belonging, and acceptance. How many times does this happen to all of us? When we feel our voice needs to be adjusted, softened, molded to fit into a space? What if, in the end, it's the space that should adjust to the plurality of voices, not the other way around? That's why I want to thank you for staying until this point, reflecting on something that seems so simple, speech, but actually holds one of our greatest powers, the ability to express who we are. One last favor, listen. Listen to the voices around you without prejudice, without rushing to judge. Listen beyond accents, beyond colloquial expressions, beyond formality or lack thereof. Listen to what people are really trying to say, because ultimately understanding others isn't just about hearing, it's about empathy. If this conversation made you think differently, tell me in the comments. Have you ever felt your voice was an obstacle? Have you changed your way of speaking to fit in? Let's continue this discussion together. Of course, if you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We still have many reflections ahead, and I promise the next questions will make you think even more. See you in the next video. Until then, take care of your voice and your essence.